On the morning of June 5th, 2009, a veteran Los Angeles police detective walked down into the basement jail area of Parker Center, the old LAPD headquarters downtown. She had been told there was someone in custody who might know something about a stolen artwork, and because art theft was her specialty, she figured she was being brought in to help. But when she stepped into the small interview room, the two detectives waiting for her did not bring in a witness or a suspect. They asked her to sit down, and as she lowered herself into the chair, she smiled a little, glanced from one detective to the other, and tried to work out why this suddenly felt less like a favor between colleagues and more like a trap. Then one of the detectives asked her about a woman who had been murdered 23 years earlier. To understand why that question mattered, you have to go back to a quiet Monday morning in February of 1986, to a gated townhouse complex in Van Nuys, California. And you have to start with a woman named Sherri Rasmussen, who woke up that morning feeling sick, newly married, and with no idea that an old problem in her life was about to come through the door. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old, and by 1986 she had already built the kind of career that made people stop and look twice. She was a nurse, but not just someone clocking in and out of hospital shifts. She was brilliant, organized, intense in the best way, and already a director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, which meant she was young enough that people sometimes underestimated her, and good enough that they usually only made that mistake once. John Rillerton, her husband, absolutely adored her. John was an engineer, bright and social, the kind of guy who could talk his way through almost any room, and when he met Sherri, he was just completely taken with her. They had only been married for about 3 months, so the townhouse still had that newlywed feeling to it, routines still forming, furniture still finding its place, little ordinary habits that had not had time to become boring. On the morning of February 24th, Sherri moved around the bedroom slowly, one hand near her stomach, trying to decide whether she could push through the day or whether she should finally admit she was sick. She did not like missing work. People depended on her, and Sherri was the kind of person who felt that responsibility physically, like a hand on her back pushing her forward even when she needed to stop. But that morning her body was not cooperating, and after standing there for a moment, looking at the clothes she had meant to put on, she decided to call in sick. John was getting ready for work in that small weekday rush, shirt, keys, papers, the ordinary sounds of drawers opening and closing. He checked on Sherri before he left, and she tried to reassure him that she was fine, or at least fine enough to rest for a few hours and see how she felt. Then John went downstairs. The garage door rumbled open, his car backed out, and the townhouse slowly settled into quiet. At first, that quiet probably felt good to Sherri. She was newly married, busy, and exhausted, and the idea of having the house to herself for a few hours, making tea, lying down, maybe handling a couple of small errands later if she felt better, felt like the exact kind of pause she needed. She moved through the downstairs area in her robe and nightclothes, slower than usual, listening to the little noises of the place she and John were still making into a home. But there was another thing sitting in the background of Sherri's life, and she could not quite make it go away. Before John married Sherri, he'd been involved with another woman named Stephanie Lazarus, who was a Los Angeles police officer. And according to Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, Stephanie had not quietly accepted that John had moved on. Sherri had told Nels about uncomfortable encounters, phone calls, visits, and moments where Stephanie seemed to appear in places she should not have been. Sherri did not know whether she was supposed to be angry, frightened, embarrassed, or all of those things at once. The detail that really bothered her was the badge. This was not just an ex-girlfriend making awkward calls or refusing to let an old relationship die. Stephanie carried a gun for work, knew how to move through the world with authority, and had the kind of confidence that could make an ordinary confrontation feel much harder to handle. Sherri wanted John to draw a harder line. She wanted him to tell Stephanie clearly that the relationship was over and that she needed to leave them alone. But John seemed to believe the easiest way through it was to avoid feeding the problem, to let time do what confrontation might only make worse. Sherri tried to accept that, but when she talked to her father about it, she cried. Still, on that Monday morning, Sherri was not trying to solve that whole mess. She was sick. John was at work, and the townhouse was quiet enough that, for a little while, nothing about the day looked like anything except a young woman trying to get through a sick day in her own home. At some point, Sherri moved through the living room and glanced toward the stereo equipment, then toward the stairs, then back into the small open spaces of the townhouse. She was probably thinking about whether she should go back upstairs and lie down, or whether she felt well enough to stay up a bit longer. Then, somewhere near the front of the home, there was a sound. Sherri turned toward it. That evening, just before 6 o'clock, John Ruetten pulled into the townhouse complex and slowed almost immediately. The garage door was open, which made no sense. Sherri's silver BMW, the car he had bought her as an engagement gift, was gone. John sat there for a second with both hands still on the wheel, staring at the open garage, trying to arrange those facts into something harmless. He knew Sherri had stayed home sick. He knew she would not usually leave without telling him. And then he saw broken glass on the driveway. John got out of the car and walked toward the townhouse, calling Sherri's name before he was even fully inside. The house did not answer him. As he stepped in, he saw things that looked wrong in small, theatrical ways. Electronic equipment stacked near the stairs, items pulled out, pieces of the house disturbed, as if someone had started a burglary and then suddenly abandoned. For a few seconds, his mind had somewhere to go. Maybe it was a break-in, maybe the car had been stolen, maybe Sherri had gone for help, and for a few seconds he could almost make himself believe that. Then John moved farther into the townhouse, and the story his mind was trying to build fell apart. Sherri was on the living room floor. When Los Angeles police detectives arrived at the Van Nuys townhouse, the first theory came together quickly. The BMW was missing. Electronics had been gathered near the stairs. A door had been left open, and from the outside it looked like Sherri had surprised burglars inside the home and been killed when the burglary went wrong. Detective Lyle Meyer and his partner Steve Hooks began working the case from that angle. They moved through the townhouse carefully, stepping around broken glass and blood, looking at the overturned furniture, the shattered porcelain vase, the bloody handprint near the alarm's panic button, and the stereo equipment that seemed to have been gathered for someone to carry away. The scene was ugly and confusing, but at least there was a version of it that made sense. Maybe two men had broken in. Maybe Sherri had come downstairs and caught them. Maybe there had been a struggle, then panic, then the burglars had taken the car and fled. But even early on, some details did not sit comfortably inside that theory. The fight in the living room had been intense, not quick. Sherri had not simply been surprised and killed instantly. She had fought hard enough that the room itself seemed to have been knocked apart around her. There were defensive injuries, a bite mark on her arm, and 3 gunshot wounds from a .38 caliber weapon, with at least one shot fired through a quilted blanket. That blanket bothered people later, because it made the shooting feel less like blind panic and more like someone trying to control the sound. Still, the burglary theory became the official path. Detectives looked for the missing BMW, which was eventually found abandoned. They looked for men connected to other break-ins. They looked at the idea of a random home invasion in a gated complex in the middle of the day. And as the days passed, the investigation kept moving, but not toward an arrest. Then Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, came to detectives with a very different theory. Nels was not a detective, but he knew his daughter. He knew what she had told him, and as he sat across from investigators, he kept returning to the same person, the woman John used to date, the one Sherri had been worried about, the one Nels kept calling the lady cop. Nels told them Sherri had been scared of Stephanie. He told them about the visits, The tension, the fact that Stephanie had not seemed to accept that John had married someone else. From Nels's point of view, this was not just a grieving father grabbing at a theory because he needed someone to blame. His daughter had been killed in her own home after a violent struggle, and one of the few people she had specifically described as a problem was an armed police officer with a personal connection to her husband. But the detectives did not follow that thread very far. They told Nels the evidence pointed to a burglary. They showed him sketches of possible male suspects. They focused on the missing car and the apparent theft. And Nels, sitting there with a father's certainty and no badge of his own, could not make them see the case the way he saw it. Months went by. Then years. The murder books filled with reports, diagrams, notes, and photographs, and eventually they were boxed away with a quiet finality that happens when a case is not solved, but everyone still has to move on to the next one. Sherri's family did not move on. Nels kept calling, kept asking whether they had looked into the lady cop, and when DNA testing became more common, he pushed for the evidence to be tested, even offering to pay for it himself. For a long time, nothing changed. Years later, a criminalist named Jennifer Francis was reviewing cold cases for the LAPD when she opened the Rasmussen file and noticed something that made her stop. The report said a swab had been taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm, but the swab was not where it was supposed to be. Francis sat with that for a moment, then started doing the thing that good investigators do when a piece of evidence is missing. She started looking. She called the coroner's office. She asked about old freezer storage. People began searching by hand through evidence that had been sitting there for years, and eventually they found a damaged manila envelope. Moisture had worn away part of the case number, but the name on the front was still clear enough. Rasmussen. Inside were the swabs from Sherri's bite mark. When the DNA results came back, Francis saw the first real fracture in the old burglary theory. The saliva from the bite mark belonged to a woman. That should have changed everything. But the case still did not move the way it should have. There was a way, at least theoretically, to keep the old theory alive. Maybe one burglar had been female. Maybe it had been a man and a woman. Maybe the burglary theory did not have to die just because the DNA made it harder to believe. So the evidence went back into storage. And for a few more years, that was where it stayed. In 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall of the Van Nuys Homicide Unit came into work and found the Rasmussen file waiting for review. There was nothing dramatic about it at first. No witness walked in. No confession arrived. No new suspect suddenly appeared at the front desk. It was just an old murder book, thick with paper and photographs and assumptions, sitting in front of him like a box no one really wanted to open again. Nuttall sat down and started reading. He read the original theory about two male burglars. He read the description of the townhouse, the missing BMW, the stacked electronics, the violent struggle, the gunshots, and the bite mark. Then he reached the DNA report saying the person who had bitten Sherri Rasmussen was female. Nuttall stopped. He leaned back from the file and just looked at it. This was not a small inconsistency that could be tucked into the margin and ignore. This was the kind of contradiction that makes a detective go back to the first page and ask whether the whole foundation of the case had been wrong. If the saliva in the bite mark came from a woman, then why had the investigation stayed locked for so long on two male burglars? Nuttall brought in his partner, Detective Pete Barba, and the two of them began reading the murder books again. This time, the file did not feel like paperwork from a dead case. It felt like they were walking back into the townhouse 23 years later and seeing the room with different eyes. The stacked electronics looked less convincing. The untouched jewelry mattered more. The gated complex mattered more. So did the fact that Sherri had been homesick and had not been expecting strangers. The old burglary theory did not collapse all at once. But as Nuttall and Barbara kept reading, pieces of it started coming loose in their hands. They made a list of women connected to the case. It was not a long list. Some names could be eliminated quickly. Others needed more checking, and one of them was the same woman Nels Rasmussen had been talking about for more than 2 decades. Stephanie Lazarus. She had dated John Ruetten before he married Sherri. She had been an LAPD officer in 1986, and by 2009 she had become a respected detective in the department's art theft unit. At first, Nuttall and Barbara did not treat her like the obvious answer, because on paper she looked almost too unlikely. She was one of them. She had a career. The old relationship with John was decades in the past. Then Nuttall spoke to Nels Rasmussen. Nels told him the same thing he had been trying to tell detectives since 1986. Sherri had been worried about Stephanie. There had been visits, confrontations, and attention Sherri did not know how to end. Nuttall listened, took notes, and when he hung up, the female DNA no longer felt like some odd loose thread. It felt like it might be pointing directly at the one person the first investigation had been warned about almost from the beginning. So the detectives began checking what they could check quietly. They learned Stephanie had been off duty the day Sherri was killed. They learned she had owned a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, the same general kind of weapon that fit the bullets in the case. They also learned she had reported the gun stolen just weeks after the murder. None of that was enough by itself. Nuttall knew that. A strange history, a day off, and an old missing gun could make a detective sit very still at his desk and still not be enough to put handcuffs on anyone. The case needed something clean, something that did not care about memory, old notes, missing reports, or 23 years of people explaining things away. It needed DNA. The problem was that Stephanie Lazarus was not just any suspect. She was LAPD. She worked inside the same world as the people now looking at her, which meant if she sensed the investigation too early, the case could leak into department gossip before the detectives had what they needed. So they arranged surveillance. One day, Stephanie went to a Costco in Simi Valley with her daughter. She sat outside, had a drink, used a straw, and threw the cup away like it was nothing. A surveillance team waited until she was gone, then moved in and retrieved it. 2 days later, the lab results came back. When Nuttall saw them, the old file in front of him was not cold anymore. Based on the DNA evidence and what investigators later established, this is what police believe happened inside Sherri Rasmussen's townhouse on February 24, 1986. That morning, after John left for work, the killer called the townhouse, hoping to hear his voice. But John was not the one who answered. Sherri did. The sound of Sherri's voice changed something. The killer stood with the phone in their hand, listening to the woman who was now living in John's house, sleeping beside him, sharing the life the killer still could not stop turning over in their mind. For a moment, there was probably a chance to hang up and let the anger burn itself out the way it had before. But this time, it did not burn out. The killer hung up. They stood there for a few seconds, breathing through the old jealousy and the humiliation and the sense that Sherri had taken something that belonged to them. Then the thought narrowed into action. The killer gathered a gun and cord, then drove to Van Nuys. At the townhouse complex, the killer moved with purpose, but not calm. Their hands were working, their breathing was tight, and with every step toward the front of the home, the story in their head became smaller and more dangerous. They were not thinking about prison, or a bite mark, or a swab, or a criminalist opening a freezer years later. Their mind was fixed on getting inside, and underneath that, fixed on John. Somehow, the killer got into the townhouse. Sherri turned and saw them. For a second, the whole thing must have felt unreal. Sherri was sick in her own home, still in her robe and night clothes, and suddenly the old problem she had been trying to manage was standing right there in front of her. She said something sharp. She demanded to know what they were doing there. But whatever words were exchanged, the room shifted almost immediately from confrontation into violence. The killer moved on her. Sherri fought back hard. She grabbed, shoved, twisted, and tried to get away, not giving the killer a single clean second to control her. The fight moved through the living room with enough force to break a porcelain vase, knock furniture out of place, and smear blood near the panic button Sherri was trying to reach. At some point, Sherri got her arm up between them, and the killer bit down on the inside of her forearm. In that moment, the bite was just part of the struggle. It was desperate, ugly, and physical, the kind of thing that happens when two people are locked together and one of them refuses to stop fighting. But 23 years later, that bite would become the thing the killer could not explain away. The killer tried to use the cord. Sherri kept fighting. The killer struck her, and the struggle kept going, loud enough that a woman in a nearby unit heard what sounded like a fight and something falling. But no one came through the door. Then the killer used the gun. The shots were fired through a quilted blanket, as if the killer was trying to muffle the sound. Sherri was hit 3 times. Any one of those wounds could have killed her. When it was over, the killer stood in the townhouse, breathing hard, surrounded by the wreckage of a fight they had not fully controlled. Their body was flooded with adrenaline, but now they had to think like someone cleaning up a problem. So they began making the scene look like a burglary. Electronics were gathered near the stairs. The house was disturbed. Sherri's BMW was taken from the garage, and the killer left the townhouse in that car, putting distance between themselves and the living room floor where Sherri Rasmussen had fought for her life. Later, the BMW was abandoned, and the killer went back to their own life while the world spent the next 23 years treating Sherri's murder like a burglary that had simply gone unsolved. The killer was Stephanie Lazarus. She was the LAPD officer Sherri had been worried about before the murder. She was the woman Nels Rasmussen had kept trying to point detectives toward. She was John's former girlfriend. And by the time Jim Nuttall and Pete Barber reopened the case, she was working inside the same department that had failed to seriously investigate her for more than 2 decades. Once Stephanie was the answer, almost every strange piece of the case changed shape. The burglary no longer looked like the obvious explanation. It looked like staging. The missing BMW was not just a stolen car, but a way to leave the gated complex without walking out in full view. The stacked electronics were not proof that burglars had been interrupted, but part of a picture someone wanted detectives to see. And the bite mark, the detail that had been sitting in the file since 1986, became the center of everything. The DNA from that bite matched the cup and straw Stephanie had thrown away at Costco. The .38 caliber weapon matched the kind of gun she had owned, and the stolen gun report she filed weeks after the murder now looked very different. The stories Sherri had told her father no longer sounded like emotional background noise. They sounded like warnings. But before Stephanie was arrested, detectives still needed to get her into a room without tipping her off. So on June 5th, 2009, Detective Dan Jaramillo told her there was someone downstairs who might have information about an art theft case. Stephanie worked art theft, so she agreed to help and walked with him down to the basement jail area at Parker Center, chatting like it was just another day at work. Before she could enter that secure area, she had to check her gun and equipment. That meant, by the time she stepped into the interview room, she was unarmed. Inside, Jaramillo introduced her to Detective Greg Stearns. Stephanie sat down, still friendly, still in the posture of a helpful colleague. But almost immediately, the room stopped behaving the way she expected it to. No witness came in. No art theft suspect was brought to the table, and instead the detective started asking her questions. They asked, about John Rueton. Stephanie smiled and said yes, she had known him. They asked whether they had dated, and she said they had. Then the questions moved, slowly and politely, toward Sherri. Stephanie shifted in her chair. She leaned forward, then leaned back, looking away and closing her eyes for a second like the questions were strange, annoying, or simply too old to take seriously. She kept asking, in different ways, what this was about. Every time the detectives got close to the truth, she tried to turn the conversation back into something casual, something between cops, something where she was still one of them. But Jaramillo and Stearns already knew. They knew about the bite mark, the DNA, and the cup at Costco. And they knew the woman sitting across from them, trying to laugh off a 23-year-old murder, had left her saliva in Sherri Rasmussen's wound. Eventually, Stephanie stood up and walked out of the room, apparently believing she could just leave. She made it as far as the hallway. Then she was arrested. As officers moved in, Stephanie kept saying it was crazy, that it was insane. And for the detectives who had spent months walking backward through a case the department had once closed its mind around, the whole thing probably did feel insane, not because the evidence was weak, but because it had been there for so long. In March of 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. In 2015, a California appeals court upheld her conviction, rejecting arguments about the age of the case, the DNA evidence, the search warrants, and the interview at Parker Center. For years, Stephanie maintained her innocence. During later parole proceedings, she admitted that she had killed Sherri Rasmussen. Although her account of what happened was disputed by the victim's family and by prosecutors, a parole grant was later rescinded in 2024, and in February of 2025, parole was denied again. Stephanie Lazarus remains in prison. As for Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, they spent more than 20 years insisting that detectives needed to look at the lady cop. In the end, the piece of evidence that proved them right had not been a confession, or a witness, or a sudden dramatic break in the case. It had been sitting for years in a freezer, inside a damaged envelope with her daughter's name still written on the front. Everything you just heard is based on real events. Some details have been reconstructed or dramatized for the sake of the story, but the core of it, Sherri Rasmussen, the murder, the bite mark, and the investigation that finally led back to Stephanie Lazarus, that all happened. Thank you for listening to the SCP Labs podcast. If you enjoyed this one, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It genuinely helps more than you know. Until next time.